In 1881, the most hated man in America built a greenhouse. 380 feet wide, 16 gardeners, and 242 varieties of palm, and one of the nation's finest orchid collections. The newspapers called Jay Gould a robber baron, a pirate, the worst man on earth since the beginning of the Christian era. Mobs had chased him through Manhattan, and he required armed bodyguards everywhere he went for the final 23 years of his life. Yet he spent his private hours tending flowers so delicate that 1 degree of temperature variance could kill them. Now this cartoonish and almost clueless amount of power and wealth came to a man who had just a few years prior tried to corner the entire American gold market. He had accumulated metal, he had spread misinformation, and cultivated contacts in President Grant's inner circle to prevent Treasury intervention. Indeed, when the scheme collapsed, the man in the greenhouse set the American economy on fire, and yet still got away with it. You see, Jay Gould understood what it meant to survive circumstances that should have destroyed you. Before he amassed $77 million, equivalent to $71 billion today, he was a 4-year-old boy locked in a basement by his alcoholic father, forgotten in the darkness until his sisters came home and found him. His son would lose 93% of everything within 1 generation. His daughter would marry a French count who burned through $300 million. Thus, in today's episode of Old Money Empires, we trace the Gould Dynasty from that locked basement to the pinnacle of Gilded Age wealth and the spectacular unraveling that followed. Welcome to today's episode of Old Money Empires. I'm Andrew, channel owner and creator, and if you want even more hidden secrets on wealthy families and the old money lifestyle, be sure to visit the first link in the video description where you'll get access to our free Substack newsletter with over 3 years of extra video. With that said, thank you for your time, and let's get into the episode. At his zenith, Jay Gould controlled an empire that terrified competitors and fascinated the public in equal measure. His railroad holdings encompassed 15% of all track in America, the Union Pacific, the Missouri Pacific, the Texas and Pacific, and a constellation of regional lines threading through the continental interior. Western Union, the telegraph monopoly that connected the nation to itself, operated under his control. When Jay Gould wanted to send a message, he owned the wires. His fortune peaked at $77 million, a sum equivalent to approximately $71 billion in today's currency, placing him among the 5 wealthiest Americans of the Gilded Age, alongside the names Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller. Lyndhurst served as the physical monument to this accumulation, a Gothic revival estate rising above the Hudson River in Tarrytown, New York, its stone towers and pointed arches visible for miles. Jay purchased the property in 1880 and immediately commissioned the greenhouse that would become his private obsession, the largest in the nation, staffed by 16 gardeners maintaining tropical conditions year-round for specimens that had no business surviving New York winters. The man who had crashed markets and ruined fortunes spent hours among his orchids, calibrating humidity and temperature for plants that would wither if he failed them. His wife, Helen Day Miller, presided over Lyndhurst's social functions with quiet grace, managing 6 children and a household that operated on industrial scale. She suffered a stroke in 1889 and never recovered. Jay followed 3 years later, claimed by tuberculosis at 56, the same disease that had taken his mother when he was 4 years old. Joseph Pulitzer's New York World reported the funeral with striking coldness. There was no sorrow behind his leaving. There was decent respect, nothing more. The Reverend G. Englehart delivered remarks that read more like prosecution than eulogy. Mr. Gould, with his 70 millions, was one of the colossal failures of our time. He was a purely selfish man. His greed consumed his charity. He was like death and hell, gathering it all, giving back nothing. The $77 million passed to his 6 children through trusts, with not a single dollar directed to public charity. George J. Gould, the eldest son, inherited control of the railroad holdings and the expectation that he would complete his father's unfinished dream, a true transcontinental system stretching from ocean to ocean. The Gould scandals, the market corners, the bribed legislators, the armed standoffs over factory ownership fill volumes that our Substack newsletter examines in details, too legally intricate for a video format, available at no cost to those who prefer their Gilded Age history unvarnished. George would eventually command 7 major railroads from San Francisco to Pittsburgh, an empire that appeared to match his father's achievements in scale if not in cunning. But the survival instincts forged in a locked basement could not be passed down through inheritance. The Goulds traced their American lineage to 17th century New England, part of the English migration that populated the Connecticut River Valley before scattering westward into New York's rural interior. By the early 1800s, the family had established itself in Delaware County, hill country in south-central New York, where dairy farming provided modest returns and ambition found few outlets beyond the next harvest. John Burr Gould worked this land with mixed results and drank with considerably more consistency. He married Mary Moore sometime in the 1830s, and on May 27, 1836, she delivered a son they named Jason, later shortened to Jay. The boy's early years passed in the rhythms of rural poverty until January 1841, when Mary died of tuberculosis. Jay was only 4 years old, and his father remarried that same summer. The second wife survived 6 months before she too was buried. A third wife joined the household in spring 1842 and died in 1845. By age 9, Jay had watched his mother and 3 stepmothers lowered into the ground in rapid succession, and John Burr Gould offered no comfort through these losses. An alcoholic whose drinking rendered him unpredictable, he once locked young Jay in the basement and forgot him there entirely. The boy remained in the darkness until his sisters returned home and released him. A 4-year-old, abandoned in blackness, with no assurance that anyone would come. When Jay announced at 14 that he wanted education rather than farm labor, his father responded with brutal efficiency. He dropped the boy at a nearby academy with 50 cents in his pocket and a sack of clothes, then drove away without farewell. Contemporary accounts describe Jay's behavior at school in terms that suggest profound psychological damage. He kept out of games, preferred to remain indoors, and at noontime cuddled up in remote corners. When other boys approached, he refused contact. If they persisted, he would make a great outcry, break away, and sit moping until class resumed. At 18, following severe illness, he weighed 100 pounds with his overcoat on in August. The skeletal teenager who flinched from human contact and huddled in corners carried wounds that would shape everything he built and everything he destroyed. Jay Gould's commercial instincts announced themselves early. Working in a blacksmith's shop as a teenager, he proved so shrewd that he convinced his employer to accept him as a partner, then sold that stake to his own father. He was 16 years old and had already learned that sentiment had no place in transactions. Surveying came next, a skill he taught himself and transformed into professional credentials. By 19, he had published a county history, a feat of research and self-promotion that demonstrated both his intellectual capacity and his hunger for recognition beyond Delaware County's boundaries. In the 1850s, Gould established a Pennsylvania tannery in partnership with industry veteran Zadok Pratt. When that arrangement dissolved, he formed a partnership with New York leather merchant Charles Mortimer Loop. The collaboration prospered until the Panic of 1857 wiped out Loop's fortune. Gould moved quickly on the distressed assets, purchasing former partnership property at collapsed prices while his partner's world crumbled. On an autumn day in 1859, Charles Loop was found dead at his Madison Avenue residence, a pistol nearby. The whispers began immediately. Jay Gould had driven him to it. Whether the accusation was fair mattered less than the lesson Gould absorbed. Financial panic created opportunity for those cold enough to act while others grieved. The Tannery War of 1860 demonstrated that legal rights meant nothing without physical force to enforce them. When David Lee, Loop's brother-in-law, disputed Gould's ownership claims, he responded by seizing the facility, expelling the superintendent with bodily violence, and garrisoning the works with 35 armed men. Gould's countermove matched the aggression. Approximately 250 supporters gathered to his cause, and he used armed workers to force Lee's men from the property. He was 24 years old and had won his first armed confrontation over a business asset. The Erie Railroad War of 1868 brought his methods to Wall Street. When Cornelius Vanderbilt began accumulating Erie shares to seize control, Gould partnered with James Fisk and Daniel Drew to defend the company through fraud. Their method was elegant in its criminality. They printed fresh stock certificates, diluting Vanderbilt's holdings with each new issue. When Vanderbilt obtained arrest warrants, the trio fled to New Jersey with their printing press and a chest of cash, hiring armed guards to surround their hotel headquarters while they bribed legislatures across state lines. Vanderbilt eventually settled, recovering approximately $7 million and observing that he had made the mistake of kicking a skunk. But it was the gold corner of 1869 that cemented Gould's infamy and his fortune. He and Fisk accumulated gold while spreading misinformation to drive prices upward, cultivating contacts in President Grant's inner circle to ensure the Treasury would not intervene. By September, gold had climbed from $132 to $162. Then Grant ordered the Treasury to sell $4 million in gold, and the price collapsed in minutes. The Gold Room, one witness wrote, rocked as the Colosseum may have rocked when the gates of the wild beasts were thrown open. 50 brokerages collapsed outright. Another 150 were left insolvent. Wheat prices fell from $1.40 to 77 cents. Corn dropped from 95 to 68 cents. Half the American workforce, farmers, watched their harvests lose half their value while their debts remained unchanged. A mob converged on Gould's offices, eager for blood. Troops in Brooklyn were ready to march on Wall Street. Gould escaped because he had secretly sold while publicly buying. He had bet against his own scheme at the critical moment. He ran for his life from the crowd that day, and he would require bodyguards for the remaining 23 years of his existence. The boy from the locked basement had built his fortress, but his children would inherit only the money, not the survival instincts that accumulated it. George J. Gould inherited approximately 1/6 of his father's estate through trusts, plus operational control of the railroad empire and the unfulfilled dream of true transcontinental reach. At the system's peak, George commanded 7 major railroads stretching from San Francisco to Pittsburgh, the Western Pacific, Missouri Pacific, Denver and Rio Grande, and 4 others that together represented one of the largest transportation networks in America. The vision appeared to match his father's ambition in every dimension, but the execution proved catastrophic. Contemporary observers identified the fundamental difference between generations with uncomfortable precision. While George's aspirations seemed to rival Jay's, he lacked the relentless drive that characterized his father. One assessment cut deeper. George was never as successful nor as ruthless, although he proved a competent railroad manager. Competent. The word condemned through understatement. Jay had operated at a level competitors found notoriously perilous to challenge. A man who printed fraudulent stock certificates, fled across state lines with armed guards, and bet against his own gold scheme while the market burned. George was prey where his father had been predator. The Panic of 1907 exposed every weakness in the younger Gould's position. Unlike Jay, who had survived 1857 by exploiting chaos and purchasing distressed assets while competitors collapsed, George possessed no instincts for crisis because crisis had never been required of him. Western Maryland declared bankruptcy in 1908. Western Pacific, Denver, and Rio Grande, and Missouri Pacific entered bankruptcy in 1915. That same year, George was expelled from Missouri Pacific leadership, removed from the company his father had built through decades of manipulation and consolidation. Even investment from Rockefeller interests could not salvage his overextended empire. The mathematics told the story with brutal clarity. Jay Gould's estate at death, $72 million. George's estate at death in 1923, $30 million gross, but after taxes and creditors extracted their claims, just over $5 million remained for his heirs. From $72 million to $5 million in one generation. 93% of the fortune vanished. The psychological architecture forged in that locked basement could not be inherited, and George had grown up protected, comfortable, untested by deprivation or abandonment. When panic arrived, he had no survival instincts because survival had never been at stake. Jay had learned at 4 years old that the world would abandon you in darkness without warning, and that lesson, burned into his nervous system before he could read, produced the hypervigilance, the paranoid preparation, the willingness to destroy competitors before they could destroy him. George had learned that money existed, that comfort was normal, that fathers provided rather than abandoned. These were reasonable lessons for a reasonable life, and they were fatal lessons for managing a railroad empire during financial collapse. So while George fumbled the family railroads into receivership, his sister Anna was learning that even $15 million could not protect her from a French aristocrat who viewed American heiresses as penance. On March 14, 1895, Anna Gould married Count Boniface de Castellan in a Manhattan ceremony that newspapers covered with obsessive financial calculation. $15 million total, $750,000 annually, nearly $2,000 flowing from American heiress to French aristocracy every 24 hours. Bonnie was European nobility requiring capital. Anna was American capital requiring a title. She purchased social standing. He purchased access to one of the largest fortunes on the continent. The arrangement was common enough among Gilded Age families. American industrial wealth exchanged for European pedigree, new money buying old legitimacy. What followed was uncommon, one of history's most spectacular exercises in financial destruction. In 5 years, Bonnie burned through $7.7 million, equivalent to $251 million in current value. The spending was so disconnected from reality that American psychiatrists coined the term coenesthesis to describe his condition, flamboyant excess combined with complete inability to comprehend financial limits. 1 year after the wedding, Bonnie purchased 2.5 acres in Paris and announced his intention to build a palace that would surpass Versailles. The Palais Rose, named for its pink marble facade, featured an immense ballroom, a private theater seating 500 guests, and a grand staircase modeled on the Paris Opera. Maintenance costs alone would have strained European monarchies. The palace was merely the centerpiece of his spending. Bonnie maintained 2 countryside chateaux, a villa in Deauville, and a 1,600-ton yacht requiring a crew of 100 sailors. His art collecting approached mania: Gobelin tapestries, Rembrandt portraits, a 13th century cathedral carpet, a clock that Louis XIV had presented to the Pope. In his memoirs, titled, with no apparent irony, The Art of Being Poor, Bonnie admitted the compulsion that drove him. "I was driven by passion as strong as that of some players for cards." He called it my slide into the abyss. The humiliation Anna endured extended beyond financial hemorrhage. When touring their first Paris apartment, Bonnie described their bedroom as the expiatory chapel and the other side of the coin. Anna was penance, the price extracted for access to her inheritance. Bonnie's relationships with both men and women were an open secret in Parisian society, providing endless material for gossip columns and literary inspiration. Marcel Proust immortalized him as Robert de Saint-Loup, a bisexual aristocrat embodying Belle Époque decadence. Anna had married a man who openly mocked her while treating her fortune as inexhaustible. The final humiliation arrived in 1906. Anna returned home one evening to find the electricity cut off. Bonnie had failed to pay the bills. She filed for divorce immediately, severed his access to all funds, and sent his personal effects to his parents' residence like luggage after a canceled trip. Over 11 years, Bonnie had spent $10 million, nearly 70% of Anna's inheritance, equivalent to over $250 million in modern currency, evaporated into pink marble and old masters. But Anna's revenge was surgical in its precision. In 1908, she married Bonnet's cousin, the Duke of Talleyrand, elevating herself from countess to duchess while forcing her former husband to watch his ex-wife outrank him within his own family. When Bonnie sought Vatican annulment to erase the marriage from church records, Anna fought him through 6 separate trials over 14 years. The final decision in 1925 upheld the validity of their union. She won twice, escaped with her remaining fortune intact, and prevented Bonnie from pretending their marriage never happened. But another Gould daughter had already chosen a different path, one that would transform the family name from symbol of greed into something approaching redemption. If Jay Gould experienced a moment of transcendent ethical choice during his lifetime, some turning point where conscience overcame calculation, extensive research confirms that no such moment exists in the historical record. His daughter, Helen Miller Gould, spent her entire adult life providing one. After her mother's death in 1889 and her father's in 1892, Helen became caretaker of her younger siblings and administrator of the family estate. To manage her inheritance independently, rather than through male intermediaries, she enrolled in New York University School of Law and graduated in 1895, an achievement unusual for any woman of that era and unprecedented for an heiress who could have retained any attorney in America. What followed was systematic philanthropy that functioned as generational atonement. When the Spanish-American War commenced, Helen donated $100,000 to the federal government, equivalent to $3 million in current value, plus an additional $50,000 for military hospitals. She funded New York University's library building and established the Hall of Fame for Great Americans. She contributed $150,000 to Woody Crest, a residential facility for children with disabilities. She supported both the YMCA and YWCA throughout her lifetime. Most significantly, she transformed Lyndhurst, her father's fortress with its greenhouse and orchid collection, into something Jay had never permitted, a space open to others. She welcomed impoverished families to the estate grounds. She established a sewing school for young women in the outbuildings. She made the sanctuary accessible. The press began calling her America's Sweetheart, a title her father could have never imagined attached to the Gould name. The contrast was absolute. The most despised man in Gilded Age America had produced a daughter the nation genuinely adored. Helen married at 45, choosing love over advantage. Her husband was Finley Shepard, a railroad executive without fortune or social ambition. Together they adopted 3 children, including a 3-year-old boy who had been abandoned on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral. They named him Finley J., honoring both husband and father. An abandoned child, rescued from the cathedral steps, given the name of a boy once locked in a basement and forgotten. Helen understood what her father's childhood had cost him and what his methods of survival had cost everyone else. The greenhouse remained operational until 1945, when its orchid collection was sold to benefit the Red Cross. The structure itself was demolished in 1969. Today, only the steel skeleton remains, a monument to something no longer there. Jay Gould built a $77 million fortress from trauma no child should experience. The architecture, ruthlessness forged in abandonment, hypervigilance born in darkness, proved impossible to transfer through inheritance. George, raised in comfort, lost 93% within 1 generation. Anna married a man who spent $300 million on pink palaces while calling her penance. Helen spent 46 years giving back what her father had gathered in. In his final years, Jay reportedly observed, "I do not want my children to be speculators. I would be a happier man if I was not so rich." The wish came too late. The basement door had closed behind a 4-year-old boy more than 50 years earlier, and everything that followed, the armed confrontations, the market crashes, the $71 billion, flowed from that darkness into a world that never quite forgave him for surviving it. And with that said, we'd love to see you in the comments. Before this video, were you familiar with the Gould's wild family history? We look forward to seeing you below, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Old Money Empires.